Something is fracturing right now, and most people can feel it even if they can't name it. It's not just political instability or economic uncertainty. It's something deeper, something structural, something that holds shared reality itself together. The institutions people trusted are losing authority. The frameworks people use to make sense of the world are cracking. Conversations that used to be possible are becoming impossible. If you've been feeling like the ground beneath you is shifting, like things that were supposed to work simply don't anymore, like the rules everyone agreed on suddenly stopped applying, you are not losing your mind. You are perceiving something real. And the framework that best explains what you're experiencing doesn't come from any headline or political commentator. It comes from the work of Carl Jung, who studied the psychology behind exactly this kind of collective unraveling, and who left us a map for navigating it. Before we go deeper into this, if this kind of knowledge speaks to you, subscribe to the channel. This is where we keep building on this work together, and what's coming in the next few minutes will change how you see everything unfolding around you. Carl Jung was not a mystic or a prophet. He was a psychiatrist and psychologist who spent over 50 years studying the deepest structures of the human psyche, the patterns that shape behavior, meaning, culture, and collective experience. His collected works span 20 volumes and draw on everything from ancient mythology to modern neurology, from medieval alchemy to contemporary political psychology. He founded analytical psychology, which recognized that the unconscious is not merely a personal basement of repressed memories, but a vast shared dimension of the human mind, what he called the collective unconscious, containing patterns that repeat across every culture, every age, every civilization. And it was precisely this understanding of the deep structure of the human psyche that allowed Jung to see something in the middle of the 20th century that most people are only now beginning to recognize: that civilizations don't collapse only for political or economic reasons. They collapse because of what happens in the collective psyche. What makes Jung's framework particularly relevant today is not theory. It's the fact that he witnessed and documented a civilizational collapse in real time. In 1936, as the Nazi movement was taking hold of Germany, Jung wrote an essay called Wotan, a psychological analysis of what was happening to the German collective psyche. He wasn't analyzing politics or economics. He was identifying a specific psychological phenomenon: an entire nation losing its relationship to the conscious, rational mind and being seized by what he called an archetype, an ancient autonomous pattern from the collective unconscious. He described this not as metaphor but as clinical psychological reality. This was his central observation, that when a civilization loses its connection to the deeper layers of the psyche, when it suppresses or ignores what lives in the unconscious, those unconscious forces don't disappear. They gather power, and eventually they take over, not from the outside, but from within. The concept at the center of Jung's framework is the collective unconscious, and it's worth understanding precisely what he meant by this, because it's far more concrete and operational than it might sound. The collective unconscious, in Jungian psychology, is the layer of the psyche that is not personal and not learned. It is inherited. It contains the psychological patterns that humans have carried across the entire arc of evolutionary history, the archetypes. These are universal organizing structures, ways of experiencing the world that appear in every culture's myths, dreams, art, and religious symbols. Things like the Great Mother, the hero, the wise old man, the shadow, the self. These aren't just abstract ideas. They function like psychological gravity, invisible, powerful, operating whether or not you're aware of them. And when the archetypal structures that organize a civilization's shared meaning begin to weaken or fail, everything that depended on them starts to dissolve. This is what Jung saw happening in his time, and applying his framework to what we're witnessing now reveals patterns that are almost impossible to ignore. To understand how collapse works through the Jungian lens, you first need to understand how culture actually holds together. In Jung's framework, cultures are not primarily held together by laws, institutions, or shared beliefs. Those are surface expressions of something much deeper. What actually holds a culture together is a functioning set of archetypes, living, activated patterns in the collective unconscious that give shared meaning to life, death, suffering, and transcendence. When these patterns are alive, people can agree on what matters, can communicate across differences, can find common ground even in conflict. They share an invisible psychological infrastructure, a myth, a story that makes the world make sense. Jung called this the archetypal foundation of culture. And it is this foundation, not the institutions themselves, that keeps a civilization coherent. Institutions are only as stable as the psychological ground they rest on. Here is where it gets concrete. Archetypes function as what you might call organizing principles of experience. They are the templates through which humans make sense of the world. Every culture has a version of the archetype of the hero, the mother, the trickster, the threshold guardian. These patterns aren't learned from books. They emerge from the collective unconscious and shape how entire populations perceive reality, assign meaning, and coordinate behavior. When these archetypal patterns are functioning, when they're being enacted through ritual, story, art, religion, and cultural practice, they create a kind of collective coherence. People may disagree on surface things but share a deeper psychological language. They can navigate conflict without the conversation becoming existential. But when these patterns begin to lose their living quality, when the cultural forms that carry them become hollow, something profound begins to shift in the collective psyche. The first sign that the archetypal foundation is weakening, the earliest indicator that something structural is failing, is what Jung observed as the desacralization of symbols. This is when the shared symbols that used to organize collective meaning lose their authority. People stop being able to take them seriously. The rituals become empty. The stories no longer resonate. The institutions that were supposed to embody those archetypes are seen as corrupt, hollow, self-serving. This is not just cynicism or disillusionment. In Jungian terms, it's a clinical indicator. It means the archetype is no longer flowing through that particular cultural form. The symbol has become a sign, a dead representation, rather than a living connection to the deeper layer of the psyche. And this is precisely where vulnerability begins to accumulate. Because when the official channels through which a culture processes its collective unconscious material become blocked or discredited, that material doesn't disappear. It has to go somewhere. Jung documented this exact process in his 1936 essay, Wotan. What he was observing in the Nazi movement wasn't political analysis. It was psychological autopsy of a civilization losing consciousness. He identified that Germany had suppressed and desacralized its traditional relationship to the deeper layers of the psyche, that the official cultural containers had become too rigid, too disconnected from the living archetypal layer. And when that happened, the repressed archetypal energy found a new channel, an ancient Germanic archetype called Wotan, the god of storm, frenzy, and possession. Jung described one man who is obviously possessed, infecting an entire nation because the collective psyche was primed for possession. This wasn't supernatural, it was psychological. Entire masses of people lost access to their rational minds and became conduits for an autonomous archetypal force operating from the unconscious. The institution of reason collapsed. The capacity for self-reflection evaporated, and what filled the vacuum was whatever archetype was most powerfully constellated in the collective unconscious at that moment. This phenomenon, what Jung called collective archetypal possession, is not a historical anomaly or something specific to pre-war Europe. It is a recurring pattern in the history of civilizations, and it has a specific psychological signature that appears consistently. The possessed collective loses the capacity for nuance, for ambivalence, for holding contradictions simultaneously. Everything simplifies into absolute categories: us and them, pure and contaminated, saved and damned. Individual judgment surrenders to the judgment of the group. The ability to question the dominant narrative becomes psychologically uncomfortable, then socially dangerous. And crucially, the possessed collective becomes absolutely convinced of its own righteousness, because the archetype it's been taken over by always feels like truth, like salvation, like the obvious and necessary response to obvious and intolerable threat. This is not unique to any political orientation. It is a pattern in the architecture of the collective psyche itself. And here's the part that makes this dangerous in our time. Archetypal possession doesn't announce itself. It never does. The people inside it are the last ones to recognize it. That's the nature of unconscious possession. The defining characteristic is lack of awareness that it's happening, which means the only people who can see it clearly are those who have maintained their relationship to their own unconscious, who have done the work of differentiation, who have learned to recognize where they end and where the archetype begins. And that is exactly what Jung spent decades trying to teach, not because it was interesting, but because he believed it was the only possible protection against this specific kind of collective destruction. If you're starting to see this pattern in what's happening around you right now, write in the comments, "I see the pattern," because recognizing it is the beginning of the only real preparation. There is another Jungian concept that illuminates what's happening with even more precision, one that Jung borrowed from the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus and built into the center of his psychological framework. It's called enantiodromia, the tendency of any extreme position, when held long enough and with enough one-sidedness, to flip violently into its opposite. Jung described this as a natural law of psychological equilibrium, not a metaphor, but a pattern he observed operating reliably in both individual and collective psyches. What it means in practical terms is this: when a civilization organizes itself around one extreme pole of experience, when it suppresses, denies, or devalues the opposite pole, the suppressed pole accumulates compensatory energy in the unconscious, and at some point that accumulated energy reaches a threshold. And when it does, it doesn't emerge gradually, it erupts. Applying this framework to modern Western civilization reveals a pattern that has been building for over 2 centuries. The dominant organizing principle of modernity has been rational materialism, the progressive elimination of the non-rational, the spiritual, the emotional, the instinctual, from the official worldview. Science became the only valid form of knowledge. Measurable outcomes became the only valid form of meaning. The inner life was pathologized or pharmaceuticalized. Myth was dismissed as primitive superstition. Ritual was replaced by procedure. And through all of this, the opposite pole, the irrational, the spiritual, the archetypal, the instinctual, was being systematically pushed into the collective unconscious. In Jung's framework, this is precisely the condition that builds toward enantiodromia. The pressure accumulates until the suppressed content can no longer be contained. And then it doesn't emerge as enlightenment. It emerges as possession. The concept of collective shadow activation helps explain what this looks like from the outside. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, is the part of the psyche that contains everything the ego has refused to acknowledge or integrate. The impulses, qualities, and potentials that were deemed unacceptable and pushed into the unconscious. At the individual level, unintegrated shadow is projected outward. You see in others the very qualities you cannot acknowledge in yourself. At the collective level, the same mechanism operates on a civilizational scale. The unintegrated shadow of a culture is projected onto its enemies, its minorities, its scapegoats, onto anyone who can serve as the container for the collective's disowned darkness. And when this projection becomes intense enough, when the shadow is powerfully constellated, the collective begins to treat its own projections as objective reality. The enemy really does become the source of all evil. The in-group really does become the source of all good. And this is always, in the Jungian framework, a signal that the shadow has been constellated to a dangerous degree. The most visible symptom of active shadow projection at the collective level is the collapse of the capacity for nuanced communication across differences. When the shadow is strongly constellated, it becomes psychologically impossible to encounter someone on the other side of the polarization and see them as a complex human being. They become purely a representative of the projected evil. Any attempt to introduce complexity, to acknowledge that the other side might have some valid points, or that your own side might have some blind spots, is experienced not as intellectual honesty, but as betrayal. This is the psychological signature of shadow possession, the collapse of ambivalence. And when you observe that happening across a culture, when nuanced conversation becomes impossible, when acknowledging complexity becomes dangerous, when everyone is required to take a side, you are watching the collective shadow in active operation. Alongside shadow projection, Jungian framework identifies another concurrent phenomenon: collective psychological inflation. Inflation, in Jung's model, happens when the ego, individual or collective, becomes identified with an archetype. When an individual or a group stops being able to distinguish between their personal identity and the archetypal force they're carrying, they begin to believe they are the hero, the savior, the chosen, that their particular perspective represents not just one valid position among many, but truth itself, righteousness itself, the necessary and obvious correction to all that is wrong. This inflation feels like clarity and conviction. It feels like finally seeing what others are too blind or corrupt to see. It feels like purpose. But in Jung's framework, this feeling is precisely the warning signal, because that sense of absolute certainty, of being on the right side of history, of the cause being too important to question, is the hallmark of archetypal possession, not genuine insight. And beneath both of these dynamics, shadow projection and collective inflation, there is a third phenomenon that Jung identified as perhaps the most fundamental: the collapse of meaning. In his work, particularly in The Undiscovered Self, Jung wrote about what happens when the archetypal structures that gave a civilization its sense of meaning and purpose stop working, when the stories no longer convince, when the rituals no longer resonate, when the symbols have become signs, dead representations rather than living connections to something deeper. This meaning collapse doesn't announce itself as such. It arrives as a specific kind of exhaustion, a sense of futility, a growing inability to care about things that used to matter. It feels personal. It feels like depression, like spiritual crisis, like existential emptiness. But in the Jungian framework, when this meaning vacuum appears simultaneously across millions of people in a culture, it is a collective psychological signal. It means the archetypal foundation has weakened to a critical degree. One of the most important and least discussed aspects of collective collapse in the Jungian framework is what might be called the acceleration pattern. Once a civilization reaches the threshold of archetypal fragmentation, once the shadow is actively projected, once the inflation is running, once the meaning vacuum is spreading, these processes create self-reinforcing loops. The more people project their shadow, the more polarized the landscape becomes, and polarization makes shadow projection feel more justified. The more people seek belonging in inflated group identities, the more individual conscience is surrendered to collective judgment, and the less capacity remains for the self-reflection that could interrupt the cycle. The meaning vacuum drives people toward any source of certain meaning, which tends to be precisely the most inflated, most possessed options available. And the speed of these feedback loops in a highly connected information environment is historically unprecedented. Here is what makes the Jungian framework so personally relevant. The collective collapse doesn't stay at the level of the collective. It enters the individual psyche through what Jung called the participation mystique, the unconscious psychological identification that exists between individuals and their cultural environment. You are not separate from the collective unconscious. You are embedded in it, which means that what is happening at the collective level is simultaneously happening at the level of your individual experience, even if you never watch the news, even if you've removed yourself from social media, even if you've built what feels like a separate life. The fragmentation in the collective psyche shows up as fragmentation in the individual psyche. The meaning vacuum in the culture shows up as difficulty finding meaning in your own daily life. The shadow projection in the collective manifests as shadow activation in your personal relationships. This is not a metaphor. It is the operating reality of how the collective unconscious functions. In The Undiscovered Self, written in 1957, Jung was already sounding an alarm that applied directly to what we're experiencing now. His central argument was that the greatest danger of modern civilization was not external, not nuclear weapons, not totalitarianism, not technological disruption. The greatest danger was the progressive loss of the individual to the collective. He saw that mass society, with its capacity to organize enormous numbers of people around abstract ideologies and collective identities, was creating a situation where individual consciousness was being systematically dissolved into group consciousness. And the consequence of this, in his framework, was not efficiency or solidarity. It was the removal of the only thing that could actually protect against collective possession. Because possession, in Jungian psychology, can only be resisted by a strongly individuated consciousness, by someone who knows who they are beneath the collective identity, who has differentiated their own psyche from the patterns of the crowd. This is the specific trap that Jung was warning about, the one that becomes most acute precisely during collective crisis. When reality feels unstable, when meaning is difficult to find, when the future feels uncertain, the psyche naturally seeks belonging, certainty, and orientation. And the easiest available sources of these things during a collective crisis are exactly the most inflated, most possessed collective identities available. The group that has the certainest answers, the clearest enemies, the most powerful sense of sacred mission. This is psychologically coherent. The need it's responding to is real. But in the Jungian framework, surrendering individual consciousness to collective certainty during a crisis is not protection. It is the mechanism of propagation. It's how the archetypal possession spreads. Every individual consciousness that dissolves into the inflated collective removes one more voice, capable of the self-reflection that could interrupt the cycle. What you're feeling when you sense that something is deeply wrong without being able to name it, that uneasy, unsettled, dissonant feeling that arises when you try to make sense of the current moment, is not confusion or weakness in the Jungian framework. It is accurate perception. The collective unconscious communicates through feeling tone before it communicates through thought. And the specific feeling of something foundational is failing is the collective unconscious registering at a deep layer that the archetypal structures it depends on for coherence are under severe stress. People with a developed relationship to the unconscious, People who have learned to attend to the feeling tone of experience, who have developed some capacity for introspection, who haven't numbed or suppressed their inner life, will feel this more acutely, not because something is wrong with them, but because something is right. They're receiving a signal that others are filtering out. One of the most visible symptoms of collective psychological fragmentation, and one that affects the personal level directly, is the collapse of shared symbolic language. When the archetypal foundation is intact, people can disagree vigorously and still, at some deeper level, be operating within a shared psychological world. There are common points of reference, common values, common emotional responses that allow communication across disagreement. When the archetypal foundation fractures, this shared layer disappears. People are not just disagreeing about conclusions, they are operating in genuinely different psychological realities. The same words mean different things. The same events carry completely opposite emotional charge. You can have a conversation with someone and feel at the end of it that you were not speaking the same language even though you were using the same words. This is not a political problem. It is a psychological one. It is what fragmentation of the archetypal foundation produces at the level of lived experience. Here's what makes this moment historically significant in the Jungian framework, and what separates it from previous civilizational crises: the speed. Every previous collapse of this kind was constrained by geography, by the pace of information transmission, by the time it took for psychological contagion to spread from one person to another. What we are experiencing now happens at the speed of light, across all geographic boundaries, simultaneously, amplified by systems specifically designed to maximize emotional activation and minimize reflective processing. The feedback loops that Jung observed playing out over years and decades in pre-war Europe are playing out in months. This doesn't change the fundamental psychology. The pattern is identical. But it radically compresses the timeline in which the forces at play can be recognized, understood, and consciously navigated. From the Jungian perspective, there are several specific indicators that suggest a collective has crossed a psychological threshold, points past which the dynamics of fragmentation begin to self-reinforce rather than self-correct. The first is the collapse of the legitimate channels of shadow expression. Healthy cultures have built-in mechanisms for acknowledging and processing collective darkness through art, tragedy, ritual, honest political discourse, religious confession. When these channels are blocked, when it becomes socially unacceptable to acknowledge the dark side of one's own group, or when the structures meant to hold collective darkness become corrupted, the shadow that was meant to flow through those channels accumulates instead. And accumulated shadow doesn't stay calm. It seeks expression through whatever channels remain open, which are typically the most destructive ones. The second indicator is what Jungian analysts sometimes call the deterioration of the transcendent function at the collective level. In individual psychology, the transcendent function is the psyche's capacity to hold apparently irreconcilable opposites in tension. Conscious and unconscious, rational and irrational, light and shadow, until a third position emerges that transcends and includes both. This is the core of psychological growth in Jung's framework. At the collective level, the same function operates through culture, through art, dialogue, democratic deliberation, spiritual practice, forms that allow a society to sit with complexity and contradiction long enough for something new to emerge. When this capacity deteriorates, when a culture loses its tolerance for ambiguity, when every contradiction must be immediately resolved by eliminating one pole, you are watching the collective transcendent function fail. And its failure is both a symptom of and an accelerant for deeper fragmentation. There is one more personal indicator worth understanding in the Jungian framework: the intensification of dreams. Jung observed, both in clinical practice and in his own experience during periods of collective crisis, that when the collective unconscious is highly activated, the dream life of individuals tends to deepen, intensify, and become increasingly archetypal. Dreams become more vivid. Recurring symbols appear with unusual persistence. Themes of collapse, transformation, death and rebirth, navigation through dangerous territory begin to appear with striking frequency. If you have noticed your dreams becoming more intense or more strange in recent months or years, this is not random neurological noise. In the Jungian framework, it is the unconscious increasing its signal strength, attempting to compensate for the loss of conscious orientation by providing more direct access to the deeper patterns that know how to navigate exactly this kind of terrain. If this framework is giving you a way to see what's happening with new clarity, let me know by liking this video. This kind of work matters, and your engagement tells me to keep going deeper. Why do some people feel the weight of this collective shift far more acutely than others? In Jungian terms, those who have a more permeable relationship to the unconscious, whether through natural temperament, through inner work, through trauma that cracked open the ego's protective surfaces, will feel the collective dynamics more directly. This is not pathology. In an earlier era, these would be the people designated as seers, as healers, as those who could read the signs in the collective psyche and bring back information the group needed. In a modern context, they often interpret their sensitivity as disorder rather than as attunement. But from Jung's perspective, the capacity to feel what's happening in the collective unconscious is not a liability to be managed. It is the beginning of the only kind of preparation that matters. There's a compensatory dimension to all of this that Jung was equally clear about. The collective unconscious is not only the source of the problem, it is simultaneously providing the resources for the response. When archetypal structures collapse, the same collective unconscious that is fragmenting also begins to produce the compensatory material, the symbols, the dreams, the synchronicities, the sudden convergences of meaning that point toward what needs to emerge. Jung observed that the unconscious consistently moves toward integration, toward wholeness, toward what he called the self, the archetype of totality that organizes the entire psyche. This organizing force doesn't disappear during a crisis. In fact, it intensifies. The question is whether there are enough conscious individuals capable of receiving that material and doing something with it. And here is where the Jungian framework shifts from analysis to something far more alive. The paradox of enantiodromia applied to civilizational collapse. If enantiodromia is the law that extreme one-sidedness flips into its opposite, then the extreme suppression of the unconscious, the extreme dominance of rational materialism, the extreme fragmentation of the archetypal foundation, all of this contains within it, by the very logic of the principle, the conditions for its own reversal. The collapse of one set of organizing structures always precedes the emergence of something new. Jung was clear about this. Dissolution is not the end. It is the necessary preparation for a new constellation. The alchemists, whose work Jung studied extensively, had a precise word for this phase: nigredo, the blackening, the dissolution of fixed forms, which they understood as the necessary precondition for the emergence of gold. What feels like only destruction contains, in this framework, the seeds of something the previous structure could not produce. What Jung meant when he spoke of the greatest danger and the greatest opportunity being the same phenomenon was precisely this: that the same force driving the collective fragmentation is also driving the potential for an unprecedented expansion of consciousness. The pressure that the collective unconscious is generating, the same pressure producing shadow projection, inflation, meaning collapse, is also producing the intensity of feeling, the sense of urgency, the crack in the ego fortifications through which new light can enter. The question is never whether the energy is there, it always is. The question is whether enough individuals are positioned to receive that energy consciously rather than being swept away by it unconsciously. And positioning yourself to receive it consciously, that is what preparation actually means. The primary preparation in the Jungian framework is shadow integration. And this is not optional. It is the foundational work, the one without which everything else is built on sand. What shadow integration means is the willingness to encounter, with as much honesty as you can sustain, the parts of yourself that you have preferred not to acknowledge, the impulses you're ashamed of, the capacities for cruelty or selfishness or cowardice that you would rather locate entirely in others, the fears you've been managing by not looking at them directly. This is not psychological self-flagellation. It is not about discovering how terrible you are. It is about the simple but difficult act of knowing yourself more completely. Because in the Jungian framework, the shadow doesn't stop operating simply because you don't look at it. It operates without your awareness, projecting itself onto the world, making you complicit in exactly the dynamics you think you're opposing. In practical terms, shadow work in the Jungian tradition begins with a specific practice of observation. You start to notice where you have disproportionate emotional reactions, where something triggers an intensity of response that seems larger than the situation warrants. These disproportionate reactions are reliable signals that the shadow has been activated, that the material being touched is something you carry unconsciously rather than consciously. You begin to notice in others the qualities that most reliably irritate, provoke, or morally outrage you, because Jung was clear that the things we condemn most strongly in others are frequently the things we most strongly deny in ourselves. Not always. There is real evil in the world, and it deserves to be named. But the specific emotional heat, the particular quality of contempt or disgust or righteous fury, that specific charge is typically coming from the shadow, from the repressed and projected content of your own unconscious. The practical test for whether you're projecting your shadow is both simple and uncomfortable. When you notice a strong negative reaction to someone or something, you ask, what quality am I reacting to? And then you ask, where, in my own life, in my own history, in my own inner experience, does this quality exist in me? Not in some abstract philosophical sense, but where specifically have I done this, felt this, been this? This is not the same as saying, there's no valid moral concern in what you're perceiving. The question is about the added charge, the element that goes beyond the situation itself. When you can find that quality in yourself, acknowledge it without judgment and stop needing the external person or group to carry it for you. That's when the projection releases, and each projection you withdraw from the world is one less way in which the collective shadow can operate through you. The second major preparation is what Jung called individuation, and its significance for navigating collective crisis cannot be overstated. Individuation is the process of becoming more fully, specifically yourself, not the self defined by your group, your ideology, your social role, your traumatic history, but the self that exists beneath all of those conditionings, the person you actually are. In everyday language, this might sound like personal development cliches, but in the Jungian framework, individuation has a precise psychological meaning and a specific protective function. The more clearly differentiated you are, the more you know where you end and where the collective patterns begin, the more resistant you become to archetypal possession. You cannot be seized by an archetype you can recognize. The possession happens in the unconscious. Awareness is the barrier. One of the most powerful capacities to develop in this framework is what Jung called the transcendent function, and it can be deliberately cultivated. The transcendent function is the psyche's ability to hold opposites in tension, to stay with the discomfort of contradiction without collapsing it prematurely into one side or the other. In the current collective environment, where everything is being polarized and everyone is being pressured to take absolute positions, the ability to hold paradox without resolution is not just a psychological achievement. It is a form of practical resistance. When you can sit with both of these things are partly true and neither of them is the whole story, you are maintaining a space in your psyche that archetypal possession cannot enter. Because possession depends on the elimination of one pole. It requires the destruction of ambivalence. And when you can sustain ambivalence, when you can hold the tension, the possession has nowhere to root. Working consciously with your dream life is one of the most practical recommendations that emerges from the Jungian framework, and it requires no special training to begin. The dream is the primary communication channel through which the unconscious speaks. In the Jungian model, dreams are not random neurological noise, but purposive messages from the deeper layers of the psyche, consistently oriented toward the wholeness and individuation of the dreamer. During periods of collective crisis, the unconscious intensifies its communications. The dreams become more urgent, more symbolic, more direct. Simply beginning to record your dreams, writing them down immediately upon waking, before the day's rational mind has fully reasserted itself, is a practice of attending to the layer of your psyche that has the most direct relationship to the collective unconscious. And that layer, in the Jungian framework, knows things that the conscious mind doesn't. It sees the shape of things before the surface makes them visible. There is a specific structural element of psychological stability that Jungian analysis calls the ego-self axis, the living relationship between the personal, conscious ego and the deeper organizing center of the total psyche, which Jung called the self with a capital S. When this axis is strong, when there is a genuine functioning relationship between what you consciously are and what you most deeply are, you have access to an orientation that is not dependent on external circumstances. You can lose your job, your relationship, your certainty about the future, and still have access to a sense of what matters and who you are. This is not external stability. It is internal stability. And in a period of collective fragmentation, where external stability is by definition unavailable, internal stability, the kind that comes from a grounded relationship to your own deepest center, becomes the only reliable foundation. If you've been doing this inner work and feel like you're still missing a piece, like you can see the pattern clearly, but the path through it is still unclear, I left something for you in the first pinned comment. It's for those who are ready to stop circling and start moving through. One of the aspects of Jungian preparation that is least discussed, but perhaps most practically important, is the distinction between what he called conscious community and tribal bonding. Tribal bonding, the kind of community that forms around shared enemies, shared certainties, shared inflations, provides a powerful sense of belonging and meaning during times of collective anxiety. It's what's most readily available. But in the Jungian framework, it is precisely the wrong kind of community to seek out during a collective crisis, because it feeds the possession rather than countering it. Conscious community, by contrast, is built around something entirely different, around the shared commitment to individuation, to shadow work, to maintaining the capacity for self-reflection, even when, especially when, it is uncomfortable. This kind of community is less immediately satisfying than tribal belonging. But it creates a holding environment for the kind of transformation that collectively matters. There is a paradox at the heart of this preparation that Jung was careful to articulate. The goal is not to become invulnerable to the collective currents. The goal is not to become so individuated, so separate from the collective psyche, that you float above it all untouched. That kind of detachment is its own form of inflation, the inflation of the spiritual bypasser who uses inner work as a way to avoid the full weight of what it means to be human in this time. The goal, rather, is to remain fully present to what is happening, to feel the grief, the fear, the confusion, the urgency, while maintaining enough inner differentiation that you are not unconsciously carried by those feelings into the arms of whatever possession happens to be operating most powerfully in the collective field. This is the balance Jung was pointing toward, full presence without loss of self. Another concrete element of Jungian preparation involves what might be called anchoring to the eternal, reconnecting to the archetypal depth that lies beneath the surface crisis. This is not escapism. It is the opposite of escapism, the recognition that beneath the specific historical drama of this particular civilizational moment, the same archetypal patterns that have structured human experience across thousands of years are still operating. The pattern of descent and return, the pattern of death and rebirth, the pattern of chaos preceding the emergence of a new order, engaging with these patterns through myth, through art, through sacred tradition, through the kind of deep symbolic experience that the modern world has been systematically eliminating, is not a retreat from the real. It is a way of placing the real in its proper context, of finding your orientation relative to forces larger than the current crisis. Drawing the threads of this framework into a set of practical orientations, there are 5 specific approaches that consistently emerge from Jungian psychology as most relevant for the present situation. First, develop an ongoing relationship with your shadow through the specific practice of noticing and withdrawing projections. Not from abstract principle, but from the specific emotional reactions that arise in your daily encounters with the world. Second, strengthen the ego self-axis through whatever practices connect you to your own deepest center, whether meditation, analysis, creative work, dream engagement, or serious engagement with a spiritual tradition that is alive for you rather than merely inherited. Third, cultivate the transcendent function by deliberately seeking out the most thoughtful, most complex articulations of perspectives very different from your own. Not to be converted, but to build the psychological muscle of holding irresolvable difference without needing to eliminate it. Fourth, pay serious attention to your inner life during this period. Your dreams, your synchronicities, your moods, and their relationship to events in the collective, not as entertainment or distraction, but as clinical data about what's happening in the deeper layers of the psyche. And fifth, build or maintain some form of conscious community, even if it's small, even if it's just 2 or 3 people, oriented around this kind of self-reflection and mutual mirroring rather than around shared certainty and shared enemies. The fact that you know how to navigate this landscape, that you can name what's happening, that you're building the specific psychological capacities that matter, these are not small things. They are the specific things that determine the quality of consciousness available on the other side of this particular transition. Consider someone navigating a period of intense personal collapse, a relationship ending, a career dissolving, a belief system crumbling, a version of the self that could no longer be sustained. On the surface, it looks like the specific content, this marriage, this job, this worldview. But in the Jungian framework, the specific content is rarely the real material. What's actually happening is a confrontation between who the person has been organizing their life around being and who the deeper self is pressing them to become. The old structure, the persona, the set of identifications that made up the functional self is dissolving, and the dissolution feels from inside it exactly like destruction, like loss with no corresponding gain, like free fall with no floor in sight. This is the nigredo, the alchemist's blackening, not metaphor, but a genuine psychological process of dissolution that is the necessary precondition for individuation to deepen. The turning point in this process, the moment when the relationship to the collapse begins to change, is not when the circumstances improve, the circumstances often don't improve for a long time. The turning point is when the person stops fighting the dissolution and begins to engage with it differently, with curiosity rather than only terror, with willingness to see what the collapse is showing them, rather than only grief about what it's destroying. In Jungian terms, this is the beginning of a real relationship with the unconscious. It's the moment when the ego stops defending its previous form and becomes willing to be reorganized. This is what shadow work makes possible, not the elimination of darkness, but the willingness to encounter it honestly enough that it stops operating autonomously. The shadow stops driving when you turn around to look at it directly. What changes, concretely, experientially, when you begin to genuinely engage the unconscious rather than manage or avoid it, is a change in your relationship to uncertainty. Before this engagement, uncertainty is a threat. It needs to be resolved, controlled, eliminated as quickly as possible. After genuine contact with the unconscious, after you've had the experience of sitting in the unknown long enough for the transcendent function to produce something new, your relationship to uncertainty shifts fundamentally. You know, from direct experience, rather than from theory, that the space of not knowing can produce something that could not have been produced any other way. This is not resignation or passivity. It is a different kind of confidence, not the confidence that comes from knowing what will happen, but the confidence that comes from knowing that what happens can be met. And here's what Jung understood about this, that almost no one today is saying. The individuals who do this work, who individuate, who integrate their shadow, who develop the capacity to hold paradox, who maintain their relationship to the unconscious during collective crisis, are not just protecting themselves. They are doing something for the collective, not through any grand program or public mission. Simply through the quality of consciousness they bring into every interaction, every relationship, every moment of contact with the collective field. A person who has integrated their shadow does not add more shadow projection to the collective. A person who has developed the transcendent function does not feed the polarization when they encounter it. A person who is grounded in the self, rather than inflated by an archetype, offers, simply by their presence, the possibility of a different kind of contact. Jung was extraordinarily clear about this relationship between individual transformation and collective change, and he was equally clear about its limits and its mechanics. He did not believe that individual spiritual development would automatically produce collective transformation. He was not naive about that. What he believed was more precise and more demanding, that the only thing that could interrupt the cycle of archetypal possession at the collective level was a sufficient number of individuated individuals, people who had done enough work with their own unconscious that they could not be easily seized by the available possessions. Not armies of enlightened masters, just enough conscious individuals to constitute what he called, in effect, a leavening of the mass. A critical number capable of maintaining reflective consciousness during the period when the collective is most deeply in the grip of unconscious forces. This is why Jung's answer to collective crisis was always fundamentally individual, not indifferent to the collective, but oriented toward what actually produces change at the collective level. He saw, through decades of clinical work and historical study, that collective movements organized around external change without the accompanying internal work consistently reproduced the shadow they were attempting to oppose. The revolutionary becomes the tyrant. The liberation movement develops its own orthodoxy. The spiritual community develops its own hierarchy of possession. This is not cynicism. It is a psychological observation about what happens when the work of shadow integration and individuation is skipped in favor of collective action. The collective action carries the shadow of everyone who hasn't done that work, and the shadow always eventually surfaces. The specific quality that Jung identified as most essential for navigating collective crisis, the one he returned to again and again across his work, was the capacity to sustain psychological tension without premature resolution, the ability to sit with irresolvable contradiction, to hold simultaneously the grief and the possibility, the destruction and the emergence, the anger at what is being lost and the openness to what is becoming available. This capacity is not natural. It is not comfortable. The psyche instinctively seeks resolution, seeks the relief of moving to one side of the contradiction or the other. But premature resolution, in the Jungian framework, always comes at a cost, the elimination of the pole that was resolved against. And what gets eliminated is always needed later, often desperately. The capacity to hold the tension longer than feels tolerable, this is what the transcendent function is built on. And this is what makes the new thing possible. What preparing yourself actually means, in the deepest Jungian sense, is not what most people mean when they use that phrase. It is not about survival preparation, not about positioning yourself advantageously relative to the coming disruptions, not about finding the right information, or the right community, or the right framework of interpretation. All of those things have their place. But in the Jungian framework, preparation means something more fundamental. It means becoming someone who can meet what comes. Not someone who has predicted correctly or positioned correctly or escaped the consequences. Someone who has done enough inner work that the outer turbulence finds a psyche capable of receiving it, capable of being changed by it without being destroyed by it. This is the distinction between being an object of the historical forces at work and being a subject within them. Someone whose consciousness participates in what unfolds, rather than being merely swept along by it. The deepest truth about what this collapse represents in the Jungian framework is not destructive, even though it is genuinely devastating. What the collective unconscious is expressing through all of this fragmentation, all of this shadow activation, all of this meaning collapse, is a demand to be heard. The modern world built itself on the systematic suppression of the unconscious layer of human experience. It declared the inner world irrelevant, the symbolic dimension primitive, the emotional and instinctual layers inconvenient interferences with rational progress, and the unconscious, which does not disappear simply because it is not recognized, is now expressing itself at a scale that cannot be ignored. This is the compensatory function operating at civilizational scale. What is being demanded is not destruction. What is being demanded is integration, a renegotiation of the relationship between consciousness and the vast, powerful, creative, dangerous layer of human experience that modernity tried to eliminate. What becomes possible when old structures fall is something that the previous structure was specifically organized to prevent. This is always the case in genuine transformation. The new thing that emerges is not simply an improved version of what was there before. It's something that the previous arrangement would have resisted because its very organization depended on keeping it out. Jung spoke about this as the emergence of a new center, not a political or social center, but a psychological one, a new organizing principle for the collective psyche that could actually include what the previous arrangement was suppressing. What form that might take is not predictable. Jung was clear about this. The unconscious does not provide blueprints. It provides energy, images, impulses toward wholeness. The specific forms through which that wholeness gets expressed are created by the conscious participation of individuals willing to do the work of receiving and enacting what the unconscious is providing. This is what it means to be on the right side of a civilizational threshold, not in the political sense, not as a question of which faction wins, but in the psychological sense that Jung was pointing toward, Being on the right side of a threshold means maintaining enough consciousness to participate in what's actually being offered, rather than being unconsciously carried by what's being destroyed. It means having some relationship to the deeper patterns at work, the archetypal level beneath the surface drama, that allows you to perceive the threshold, as genuine passage between one form of collective organization and another, rather than only as catastrophe. Jung did not minimize the suffering of such passages. He saw it clearly in the Europe of his time, and he felt it personally. But he also saw the other dimension, the compensatory movement toward something new, and he spent his life building the psychological tools that would allow individuals to participate in that movement consciously. There is a specific responsibility that comes with this understanding, one that Jung took seriously and that the Jungian tradition has carried forward. When you can see the pattern, when you understand what's happening at the psychological level beneath the surface events, you become someone who cannot use ignorance as an excuse for unconscious participation. You cannot project your shadow and not know what you're doing. You cannot surrender to inflation and not recognize what's been seized. The awareness itself changes your relationship to the forces at work, and that changed relationship, even if it doesn't immediately produce external change, is a form of responsibility that matters. Not grand responsibility, not heroic responsibility, simply the responsibility of someone who sees clearly enough to act accordingly in the specific, immediate, ordinary circumstances of their daily life. What you carry now that you couldn't have carried before this framework is a specific kind of perceptual capacity, the ability to read the landscape you're moving through at a depth that most people don't have access to recognize shadow projection when it appears, in yourself and in the collective, to feel the pull of inflation and know what it is, to understand the meaning vacuum not as personal failure but as collective signal, to hold the paradox of dissolution and emergence simultaneously without collapsing into either premature despair or premature optimism. These capacities are not intellectual achievements. They don't give you answers or predictions or a map of what comes next. What they give you is something more valuable, a relationship to the depth of what's happening that allows you to be present to it without being consumed by it, and to bring that presence into every conversation, every choice, every encounter with the world as it actually is. And there's one last thing worth saying about this, something that Jung understood in the deepest way. The work of psychological preparation is not separate from the work of living. It is the work of living. The shadow integration happens in your actual relationships, your actual conflicts, your actual moments of reaction and resistance. The individuation happens through your actual choices, your actual fidelities and betrayals of your deepest values. The development of the transcendent function happens through your actual encounters with contradiction, in your family, your work, your community, your inner life. There is no retreat from the world that accomplishes this work. The world is the laboratory. The mess is the material. The difficulty is not a detour on the path. It is the path. And the preparation consists not in arriving at a place of safety before the collapse reaches you, but in developing, through ongoing, honest engagement with your actual experience, the kind of psyche that can meet what comes. In the Jungian framework, this is what individuation in the service of collective crisis looks like. Not a person who has solved their shadow, not a person who has transcended fear, not a person who has exited the historical moment and found higher ground. A person who has, through persistent honest engagement with themselves and with the world, become progressively more capable of consciousness, more capable of recognizing the forces at work, more capable of distinguishing themselves from those forces, more capable of holding the tension long enough for something genuinely new to emerge. Not perfect, not invulnerable, not enlightened, but awake enough to matter, present enough to participate. differentiated enough to offer something that the unconscious collective cannot provide for itself, the specific quality of a consciousness that knows itself, chooses deliberately, and remains oriented toward wholeness even in the midst of fragmentation. If you stayed until the end, let me know by writing in the comments. I individuate through chaos. I've placed another lesson on your screen right now, your next step on this path. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.